Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining the Balsillie School's Multilateral Institutions Research Cluster today for this discussion on the United Nations at 75, the contemporary challenges facing the organization, and in particular, the impact the pandemic is having on its ongoing operations. My name is Eric Tanguay. I am the cluster's research support officer, and I'm excited to be co-hosting this event alongside one of our cluster leads, Dr. Alistair Edgar. It's our great privilege to have Mr. Maher Nasser joining us to discuss these issues today. Mr. Nasser is a communications and public information expert who has over 33 years of work experience in the UN system. He is currently the director of the Department of Global Communications Outreach Division and the Commissioner General of the United Nations at Expo 2020. Maher has been appointed 3 times as acting Undersecretary General in charge of the Department of Global Communications. And during his tenure with the UN, he has worked at a variety of duty stations from New York, Vienna, Cairo, Amman, Jerusalem, and Gaza, where he has held positions with the UN Department of Global Communications, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the audience today as well. Regarding the format for this event, Maher will begin our discussion by speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes or so about his work with the DCG and by giving us a snapshot of some of the challenges and priorities presently concerning the UN on the eve of its 75th anniversary. After Maher's remarks, Alistair and I will pose an initial round of questions before opening things up to questions from the audience. And we would invite you to use the Q&A function on your Zoom panel if you have any comments or questions throughout the talk. And I will do my best to keep track of all of them and direct them towards Maher in the concluding half of our discussion. Mr. Nasser, thank you so much for joining us today. We're all very excited to hear from you. So I'll turn things over to you
now. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to connect. Hopefully, the technology will not fail us, and we will continue to have a very good quality sound and image. You don't need the images now. I'm not doing any presentations. Of course, this year and on Friday, we will mark 75 years of the creation of the world's first organization that brought all member states into a format whereby the notion is, let's talk, let's not fight. 75 years, we look back at those, and when we started thinking last year about how are we going to mark the 75 years of the creation of the organization, the Secretary General's vision was, this is not the time to start patting ourselves on the shoulder and saying, you know, we did this great, we did that, and to mark and celebrate and blow 75 candles. Let's use it as a moment of reflection. Let's look back at what have the 75 years been like, and where do we want to be in another 25 years when the UN turns 100. So let's engage in a global conversation. Let's invite people to share with us through global dialogues that at the time, they were actually planned to be in-person dialogues, that we created a toolkit for people to organize dialogues at the university level, at schools, in civil society organization, houses of worship, families, etc., etc. And that was before, of course, COVID. At the beginning of the year, the Secretary General spoke about his forward-looking message in his General Assembly speech in January, where he identified what he called the four horsemen that were really unsettling world order and keeping him awake at night, which is the revival of geopolitical and the increase in geopolitical tensions that the world was seeing, climate change and the return of the nuclear battle concerns, and the climate change, of course. And then the fourth one was the dark side of innovation, or what we can call the concerns about new technologies and where are we heading in the absence of ethical guidelines, regulations that can really ensure that new technologies or AI or cyber, it does not become a new battleground and then gets out of control. So these are the kinds of things that he spoke about. Hiding and lurking in the shadows at the time was, of course, COVID-19, which was the fifth horsemen that turned the world upside down. From between January and now, of course, January was where the first news about it. And in February, the World Health Organization declared it as a global issue of global concern, and then a pandemic. And it has now dictated the way we work, the way we study, the way we interact. It has had a great negative impact on the world health. We have now hit 40 million people who have been infected, over 1 million dead, and in different countries, different reactions, different impact. The economy, social economic impact did not spare any member state, even those that did not have any cases. Once the travel came to a standstill, economies slowed down, many countries, even before they had a first case of COVID, felt the impact, because tourism, which was a major source of income for many island states, many small countries, came to a halt. If they are dependent on the export of a specific commodity, that also slowed down. So the social economic impact hurt the world globally, and we hear reports from the World Bank, IMF, and others about the global GDP is expected to has shrunk already in the range of 3 to 4%, and we are witnessing and looking. Many countries have faced a recession. So these are the kinds of impacts that extended beyond the health aspect. So the United Nations response meant to really, in the middle of the 75 years, this is not the time to start saying, what are we going to we continued the dialogues, but we turned them into virtual dialogues. There was a survey. I don't know how many of you have taken the survey. The survey is still open. You can go to UN75 online and you can take the survey, and the results of the survey up to September were presented in a report to the General Assembly by the Secretary General and the USG Special Advisor on UN75, Fabrizio Hochschild. We were not surprised. Majority of the 500,000 people who took part in the survey, they wanted to see more cooperation. They recognized, of course, the need for a stronger health system to counter the rise of potential new zoonotic diseases. Climate change was again identified as a major concern and an issue that the world really needs to address. So what we have seen in the survey and the dialogues that took place before COVID and the virtual dialogues after, it narrowed us down to virtual space, is that the priorities and what the Secretary General has been highlighting and the United Nations has been driving the force to change the course of where we are heading as humanity, aligned with the views of people around the world, with the majority of the views. This year we launched the decade of action to implement the SDGs, and that is something that we think is key to dealing with the core, the causes, rather than dealing with the symptoms. If we have a stronger public health system, then most countries can respond better to the next epidemic. And we are talking about the next epidemic. The majority of epidemics that we have seen in the last 100 years are zoonotic diseases. And zoonotic diseases are diseases that come through an interaction between humans and wild animals, and a virus makes the jump from that wild animal, usually a bat, could be another type of bird or animal, and mutates and then becomes contagious from a human to human. We have seen that in SARS at the beginning of this century. We have seen it in Ebola. We have seen it in Zika. We have seen it in swine flu, bird flu, and now, of course, COVID-19. COVID-19 probably is worse because it is very easily transmitted from one person to the next through the droplets that come out from our breath, and as we speak, as we sing, as we eat, as we move. And To address it, WHO took the lead, of course, on the health side, but the UN took the mantle on everything else. So the Secretary General at the beginning of the crisis, and he has continued to reiterate the need to focus on the big enemy that is now really affecting all of us. So he called for a global ceasefire. A global ceasefire so that we can focus on the enemy of humanity, which is the virus. And there was some many positive responses in parts of the world. Most recently, unfortunately, we see a return to fighting in areas that have not had fighting for a while, and the SG is reiterating that call to a ceasefire and building around the UN 75 about the notion of living in peace. We have to do it together. Now is the time to lay down the arms and let's not fight each other. Let's focus on the single most enemy of all of us, COVID. The social economic impact has not been uniform. I mean, we know, and we see this from research, we see this from news headlines, that women have been more impacted than men in minorities. In some countries, the poorer have been more impacted than the rich. If you look at where the largest infections happened in the people who had to continue to work, couldn't work from home because they had to deliver the services, whether they are in managing the public transport, whether they are in the health sector, whether they are at the service sector, your delivery person bringing you the food and the seed who are interacting. And that's, you know, the inequality was sort of layered bare by this virus, like an X-ray. The Secretary General actually focused his Mandela lecture that he delivered last month on the issue of inequality, and it's one of the most powerful, I think, statements on the impact not only of COVID, but actually the world that we live in today. Inequality has been exacerbated. I mean, it's worse than it has ever been. When you think of the wealthiest 26 men on the planet, their wealth is equivalent to half of humanity. So almost 4 billion people, all of what they own is equivalent to that of 26 people. And that is not something that is positive in the long term, I think. So going back to the decade of action, why it matters, because if you look at what we tried to do, what the world leaders agreed to do by the year 2030, is work together to ensure that we have an end to poverty, eliminate hunger, that everybody has access to proper health services, that we all have access to education, quality education, not just any education. And today, I think the understanding of education is not just literacy. I think we have to be clear that today's education isn't just being able to read and write, because today most of what we see is also digital. So how do we also have a sort of educate people on to distinguish between the right and the misinformation, information? It's very easy, and I think this is something to confuse the two. And of course, the SDGs continue to talk about gender equality, to talk about access to water, access to sanitary facilities, decent work, economic growth, and reduce inequalities, building safe, inclusive societies and communities, and then of course tackling the issue of overconsumption. So, you know, responsible consumption, responsible production, and then climate change is a major issue. SDG 13, life on land, life underwater, peace, justice, strong institutions, and partnerships. So all of these 17 goals. I know a lot of people have said, why 17? There are too many of them. And my response has always been, from the moment they were adopted 5 years ago, is let's go and take them one by one, and you let me know what isn't important for us to reach a world in which we all can thrive in dignity, in peace, on a healthy planet. So that's what the SDGs aim to achieve, and by achieving that, we do remove the root causes of conflict, the root causes of inequality, the root causes of the spread of diseases like COVID-19. So the SG and the UN today are focused on the issues of climate change, of course, the pandemic, dealing with the impact of the pandemic across all sectors, providing and making sure that the notion of solidarity prevails, that if anything, when there's a pandemic, you cannot assume that you can deal with it, no matter how strong you are, how powerful you are. You cannot close your border to a virus. And we see this. The country with the largest number of infections is the United States of America, which is the number one superpower, the number one economy on the planet. It is 4% of the world's population, yet 20% of the world's cases, and 20% of the people who died. So your trillions of dollars of expenditure on weapons and arms and defense is useless against the virus. The economies of Europe, the strongest economies, have been brought down to their knees by this virus. So we have to get some humility, and I think as humans we have to understand that in a pandemic, the weakest link is our weakest link. So we can eradicate the virus and the disease from our country, and we have seen some countries have done that, especially if you're a far away small island like New Zealand. With travel, the virus comes back. As long as it's available somewhere on the planet, it is not gone. So what we have done in the Department of Global Communications is, of course, we are working on multiple fronts. We are promoting the UN 75 as a moment of reflection, the key values, and what people are telling us. We are, of course, talking about the need to put ourselves back on track in dealing with climate, but also in getting us to where we need to be by 2030, the SDG agenda. And for the COVID-19, what we have really focused on, and tomorrow we are launching a special campaign, is the issue of misinformation. And this is not just about the virus. Misinformation, as we see, is contributing to rising tensions. It could also impact hate situations, xenophobia, racism, and all of that, racial social injustice. And you have seen it all, the demonstrations that followed the killing of George Floyd and moved to other countries and other parts of the world. So we launched a campaign in April called Verified, which meant to address the virus of misinformation. And you will all recall at the beginning, there were many stories and people share those easily. In the old days, you had to go to somebody, talk to them to share a rumor with them. Now you just can click, and then you're shared it with 500 people on your Facebook, 2,000 people on Twitter, and so on and so forth. Just click. 5G was supposed to be causing COVID-19. It was supposed to be a conspiracy from pharmaceutical companies because Bill Gates wants to put a chip under your skin so that they can monitor all of that. Hold your breath, and then if you can speak, then you don't have it. And they spread like wildfire, and they were not only here. I mean, I can see them in Arabic-speaking countries when I see what's being talked about. So misinformation not only delay our ability to contain the virus, they have actually been responsible for killing people. Several people have ingested chlorine and harmful substances thinking that it would protect them, or refused to follow the scientific and medical advice of avoiding crowds or not wearing a mask, contracted the disease. Maybe they were fit, but they took it home, and then their grandparents died, or their father or their mother or some of their other elderly relatives. So misinformation is very, very harmful. So what we try to do is we created a website called shareverified.com, whereby we invited people to sign up as information volunteers, and we started preparing verified information that is targeting the most obvious and clear rumors, misinformation, disinformation out there, and trying to correct it, and trying to also create some kind of behavioral change that would slow down the spread of misinformation. on 30 June, we launched a campaign called Pause, Take Care Before You Share. Because research has also showed us that misinformation, disinformation relies on our instinctive emotional response when we see something that is shocking and we want to share it before we actually even verify the accuracy of that information. So you would see that's how tabloids work. They have a big headline, and then you read the article and it has nothing to do with the headline, but it just attracted you already. And I know it works because people see the headline, they go for it. The same thing. Oh my God, look at this picture. Click share before you even think about it. So take care before you share concept was based on research that if you actually interrupt that moment between getting and receiving something in your social media feed or your WhatsApp or whichever messenger app you have, just take a moment. Stop for a few minutes and look, you'll find sometimes the date is old, so the information is old. You'll find out that it doesn't make sense. That is really, do I really want my name associated with sharing this information? Or does it come from a conspiracy theory or an anti-vaxxer community that is ideologically against vaccines, but not based on science, but based on ideology or religion or whatever? So just take that moment. So tomorrow, we're launching this second part of the campaign, and the campaign is called Pledge to Pause. So hashtag pledge to pause in one word. And the notion is we're asking people to record themselves or take a video, pause for 5-10 seconds, and then say, I pledge to pause. I pledge not to share information unless I know it's verified, or something like that. Whichever way. You can go to the website shareverified.com, and then you'll find more there, or takecarebeforeyoushare.org. That's another website. And the notion there is that more people start being aware of this, it will slow down, and research has told us it will slow down the spread of misinformation, disinformation by 40-50%. And that means you're saving lives, you're contributing to. So that's now really our big focus on COVID. And I'm just looking at the time. I spoke for longer than I should. I'll stop here, and maybe Eric, back to you if there are any questions or any areas that I need to detail more, but I'm at your disposal.
That's great. Thank you so much, Maher. And it's no problem at all. We really appreciate those insightful comments you just gave us. And you brought up a number of important and fascinating issues that I think it would be great if we could just explore in a little bit more depth with you now. First, I was wondering if you could provide us maybe with a little bit more detail on how the pandemic is affecting the work of the UN in terms of the organizations adapting the Secretariat and the agencies and the Security Council. We spoke briefly before the webinar began about the effects of going virtual on diplomacy in the UN, and I think it'd be fascinating to hear a bit more about that.
No, thanks a lot. I mean, of course, the UN brings people from all around the world. We have 195 missions at the UN, people representing different parts of the world. We have thousands of staff in New York City, and the Secretary General and our health department wanted to make sure that we do not become a super spreader. We don't become a part of, contribute to anybody getting the disease. So from the moment the city started going into lockdown, we were asked to work from home. That was 16th of March. We were said, everybody works from home and abide by whatever restrictions your local authority is imposing on you. So if they're telling you not to go out in the night, don't go out in the night. We have to comply with that. Luckily, technology today enables us to connect with each other using some people use Zoom, we use Microsoft Teams, others use Skype, and so on and so forth. So the UN did not close. We did not close operations. I mean, we continued to work, especially in the field. I mean, colleagues in the field have continued to deliver World Food Program. I mean, there's no surprise that they were provided the Nobel Peace Prize this year because they continued to provide food aid to over 100 million people. Before COVID, World Food Program was providing food aid to 80 million people a year. Now it's gone up to 100, and by the end of the year, they estimate, because of the impact of COVID, it will go up to 135 million, and could double next year if we do not really contain the virus. So it is paramount for us that we continue to work. We have tried to provide colleagues who did not have the capacity to work from home. Many colleagues were actually also authorized to go and work from their countries. So they decided to, since we are telecommuting, if you're telecommuting from Long Island City or Manhattan or Brooklyn, why not telecommute from Canada or another country, because you are there with your family, your extended family. Somebody else could look after your children, because that's another major issue. I mean, it has created challenges that I'm sure every one of you have actually also faced. Working from home makes your home your office. It also has mental impacts on you. It also eliminates the opportunities for social interaction. So those elements have been impacted. And of course, the UN, what is the UN? It's a convening platform. So member states the early period could not convene with interpretation, because that's also key. Multilingualism suffered because we didn't yet have the ability to provide interpretation for meetings that are virtual. The Security Council first time met in person in the Security Council in July, but before that they met virtually, and there were differences. Can we adopt a resolution outside of the chamber? So these were legal questions and issues that you had different positions among member states. The president of the General Assembly, of course, had to shepherd also and deal with this issue of how do we hold the UNGA. So there were consultations, there were the advice from the Secretary General, from the Secretariat. We do not recommend that the UNGA takes place because of social distancing regulations. You cannot have a large number of people in one place, plus the quarantine requirements. So imagine if you're coming from a country that is designated as a high risk, then you're required to quarantine for 14 days before you come to the UN. And then if you're coming from the US, going back, you're required. So eventually member states agreed. So this was the first time in the history of the organization that the UN General Assembly, the opening session, UNGA, the general debate, was virtual. And of course, because it was virtual, because they did not have to travel to New York, it had the highest number of speeches by heads of state or government, because they could record it from whatever they were and they sent it and then it was played. But all in all, I think it worked. I think the coverage, we looked at the amount of coverage that we usually monitor that. It was in the same range. The spikes were there, and it maybe not at the same level as previous years, because also there were many less opportunities or newsy issues. Sometimes you get news that world leaders met or bilaterals, or Greta Thunberg looking at a certain president in the lift, or side events, and all of these activities, they did not happen. So we tried to recreate in the virtual space an SDG media zone, an SDG action zone to continue with the conversation in a way that does not interrupt the flow of the fact that this is the moment in time when the world comes together. Member states on the 21st of September world leaders adopted the declaration, the World Leader Declaration on UN 75, which was very, very strong statement. And the civil society actually got a good chunk of it. The first draft, and I remember seeing the first draft in March, was not one that civil society and young people were happy with. So that was tweaked and changed. So that was good. I hope that covered what you need to, Eric.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Maher. Thank you. I think Alistair has a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Maher. And as you and I were mentioned before, and we've known each other quite a while now, but it's nice to see you. I was certainly concerned about your health and the health of everybody at the UN when New York City especially was the one of the epicenters of this. It was quite horrific to see what was going on. So I'm happy to see that at least none of the people I know were directly affected in terms of their own physical health at any rate. Although I did see you at one point I know the New York Marathon has been canceled, and you're a marathon runner, so that will have hurt a lot. In terms of what the world was experiencing, partly related to the pandemic, we were already seeing increasing tensions between the United States, China, Russia. But of course, with the accusations leveled by a certain president towards China about the source of COVID, those tensions have increased considerably as well. We all talk now about the crisis of multilateralism, which perhaps has just been worsened by COVID. What do you see as happening? And you mentioned the Security Council meeting. What do you see as happening in the Council as Secretary General Guterres tries to address this divisiveness? Can the Council make progress? Do you see hope for that? Especially as we're also looking at trying to have a positive agenda for the UN at 75.
I mean, any student of politics knows that nothing is constant. So what situation we have today in terms of tension between country A, country B could change overnight when political circumstances change. But what doesn't change is the principle of the need to sit down together and cooperate rather than politicize things that divide us. I mean, the virus is a physical virus. It infects everybody from a president to a janitor and does not distinguish. And what is clear is that it's not the time now, and this is what the Secretary General of WHO is saying, is that it's not now the time. It's like fighting with the fire brigade outside of your house about being 5 minutes late and not let them deal with the fire. So let's focus on the common enemy that is really impacting all of us. And it's also a sign that if cooperation is the only way for us to deal with this problem, then cooperation is also the only way for us to deal with climate change. It's the only way with us to deal with global terrorism. It's the only way for us to deal with rising tensions in other parts of the world. So the key message is that the principles on which the UN was created, the principles of the Charter, still hold. And it's these principles that we need to hold our members accountable to their own commitments when they join this organization. And the Secretary General publicly has spoken about the disconnect between power and leadership. And he said that what we need is power and leadership coming together. What we have seen in the case of COVID, where there is leadership that is providing science-based, medical-based information, there is no authority to impose that on member states or on anybody. WHO is a technical organization. It can just say, this is what peer-reviewed science tells us, and we cannot tell you something until we are certain we know all about it. But there's no way to implement that. Where there is authority, there was a lack of leadership on this issue, which is the Security Council that can actually adopt resolutions that are binding, and that's what the Secretary General has said multiple times in the last few months. But that, of course, means that we have to keep this engagement, but it also means that we cannot just wait for that leadership to come from where it is lacking. But I think we need to also ensure that people have the tools to address the issues that impact them. How do you protect yourself? How do you protect your family? And I think this for us is following what WHO is saying. We have to do it all together. We have to, for example, make sure that we are wearing masks when we are outside. We have to wash the hands. We have to keep social distancing. We have to cough in. We have to avoid internal gatherings. At the same time, we have to also make sure that we tell our political leaders that we also want them to be guided by science and medical advice, and not by conspiracy theories. So that's the other aspect of it. People need to have the tools by which they can protect themselves, but also by which they can hold their leaders accountable. And that's what we try to do.
That's great. Thank you, Maher. You already mentioned the excellent work the UN World Food Programme has been doing prior to and especially during the pandemic, which it deservedly received the Nobel Peace Prize for recently. But in addition to worsening food security globally, the pandemic is also threatening a number of the organization's other sustainable development goals. A recent report from UN Women and UNDP estimated that as many as almost 50 million women and girls worldwide will be pushed below the poverty line as a result of the pandemic. And the World Bank's figures are estimating that possibly 115 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty. You mentioned the Secretary General's recently announced Decade of Action, and I'm just wondering if you can give us a bit of detail. There are some questions already in the Q&A about how that works in practice and what the UN is going to do over the next decade to safeguard the SDGs, and potentially, as importantly, what other countries need to do to support the UN to do.
No, thanks. I mean, up to the beginning of this year, late last year, we always refer to the great success in reducing poverty. The world from 1990, when 34% of the world's population lived under extreme poverty, to less than 9% at the beginning of this year. And as the World Bank has said, this is the first time in the last 30 years that we see a rise in poverty. So we have more people falling into poverty. Hopefully it will be temporary because of the economic slowdown, but then economies take time to come up and to make up for those lost jobs and income. We also seen that it is impacting women and girls more. And what is worse is that when there was lockdown, and we know from UN Women and statistics that 1 in 3 women have been subjected to violence in her life at some point in her life. And that in many cases, when women couldn't go out of the house, they were trapped with their abuser. So the Secretary General actually, there was the whole statement was following the call for a ceasefire. He issued a call for peace at home. Please don't violence at home is also violence. We need to also address that. In terms of the Decade of Action, I mean, world leaders approved and endorsed the SDGs in 2015, 25 September 2015. I was there at the moment of the adoption. And it probably looking back, and I think it's now no underestimating the value of that declaration. It's a blueprint for a world that we all want, and it will be hard to find anybody who can argue against it. Of course, implementation is an issue that member states have to themselves take into their own hands, but member states and governments, and we have always said, the SDG agenda is so far and so ambitious and so far-reaching that it cannot only be up to governments. So we need to engage with civil society, we engage the private sector, we need to bring everybody on board for that. So 5 years down the line, every year there's a high-level political forum, which was something that was also new. It meets in July, and in 2016, I think it was 32 countries came up and said, we would like to share our national voluntary assessment or review of what we have done to implement the SDGs. So this has become a tradition, and already about 140 countries have already done that. It's new countries every year. And that has become a measure of the progress. So 2020 was seen as 5 years. So this was a year that we're reflecting, where are we 5 years down the line? How much progress was made? You can point in some areas, in some countries, that quite a lot of progress was done. And actually some SDG targets have already been ticked in some parts of the world. But we also saw that the gap is still huge. And if we continued at this rate, it's not enough. We need to sort of like rev up the engines again and re-energize the enthusiasm around the SDGs in the last 10 years. So that's the idea behind the decade, is to reaffirm and go back to the original idea that these SDGs, yes, it's easy to think 15 years, it's a long time, like I said, like preparing to, you are students, you're preparing for the exam. So you're saying like 15 days away, I'll study in the last 2 days. It doesn't work that way. You can't make up for that time at the end. And Alistair mentioned the marathon. Yes, you can't just decide to run a marathon, however fit you are, unless you're super fit and you've been running all your life. You need to train for it. You need to prepare for it. You need to build up to that moment. So for us, if we're going to actually ensure that we deal with climate, if we ignore climate and we fix the economy, eradicate poverty, ensure gender equality, et cetera, and then comes a superstorm or rising sea waters, or the seas are dead, you have to approach the SDGs also connective, and they are connected with each other. And I think what we have done in the last 5 years, I think a measure of success is not only governments are now engaged and see the SDGs as their agenda. Several industries are actually now engaged with us on this. The advertising industry in 2016 came to us and said, we want to create something called Common Ground. We want to support the UN to make the SDGs famous. So my response to them was, we don't want to make the SDGs famous. We want you to also incorporate the SDGs in your work. Okay, help us make the SDGs famous, fine, but also we want you to be our messenger with the brands to not forget SDG 12, sustainable consumption, sustainable production. You're part of the problem. Advertisers make us buy things we don't need. So that's part of the dialogue. We just had last week at the Frankfurt Book Fair, the International Publishers Association adopted what we are calling the Publishers Compact for the Decade. So the publishing industry is now coming and adopting 10 commitments that they will, as in advertising, as publishing industry, try to work with each other and police each other. I guess we're not policing anybody. I mean, it's their compact, and they will start, peer pressure, and hopefully we'll move in that direction. We see changes. We see the biggest investment, like BlackRock, the CEO's letter to the board was only last summer, before COVID, that we need to ensure that we're investing in green energy and we're investing in things that aren't really harmful to the environment. We also saw the Business Roundtable. Again, last year they redefined the purpose of the foundation, that the purpose of the enterprise isn't just share value, improving share value for the shareholder. It also has a responsibility to improve, to all stakeholders, including suppliers, customers, staff, and the community at large. So these are things that are happening across the world because of the SDGs. And I think this needs to be accelerated. This needs to be packaged in the train that we are calling the Decade of Action. And in 2025, we will have another moment to reflect and then see where we need to really tighten things up. Of course, has COVID not made a difference? It has. It has slowed things down. That means that we have to double the work. And an investment in the development of the least developed countries is an investment in your own future, because the more there's poverty, the more there's displacement, the more there's conflict. And we all know that those do not stay contained within one border. They will come to you, one way or another.
Maher, I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I wanted to ask you one of the questions that has come up in our Q&A side, which is one of our colleagues, a lot of whose work is in rural areas of the poorer countries in the world. And her question, and this probably suits you with the Department of Global Communications, a lot of the populations that she works with, for them, access to cellular data is either impossible or at least cost prohibitive. Does the UN, does the department use also radio as a way of getting information out, which can include, I suppose, countering disinformation? Mm-hmm. But in what ways do you use, if you want, the lower tech end of communications to get messaging out to as many people as possible?
I mean, we have not discontinued anything that we used to do 10, 20, 15 years ago. I mean, we still have radio or audio programming, which we now call podcasts. We still produce content. But what has changed is, of course, the world. I mean, in addition to those that we still drive, and we have partnership with radio stations, we provide them with content. We give interview. I'm giving interviews this week to radio stations in Arabic about Pledge to Pause, the campaign, and so we of course have not done any less interaction or produced any less content in audio, video, utilizing the traditional channels. But this digital divide notion is not as it really is perceived to be. More people have access today to content than any time before. The number of cell phones on the planet are probably more than the people on the planet, and that we see that as an increase in that. People are sharing information, and there's a good side and there's a bad side to it as well. We have seen where rumors and sometimes horrendous attacks on a small community happen in certain parts of the world because of misinformation or a fake photo that incites a crowd against another. There needs to be, and that's when I go back to what I said about education, that education is no longer just about reading and writing and math skills. It's also about being able to use the new technology responsibly. And the radios that we connect with, that we provide them with content, is still there, but much of what we do today is on the net. So websites, and we have seen a massive increase in people coming to our websites. And I think more relevant than the platform for us is language. Of course, we would like to do what we do in every language possible, but there are limitations to our capacity to translate to all languages. So the UN, as you know, as students of international studies, has 6 official languages. So in addition to those 6 official languages, and through extra budgetary funding, support from other sources, we actually try in these campaigns to create content in Kiswahili, a major language in Africa, in Portuguese, that is probably 4th, 5th spread language, and Hindi. So these are also the other element is multilingualism. Are we reaching every single person? No. Are we reaching every single language? No, but we try.
That's great. Thanks very much, Maher. We are running low on time, so I'll try to lump a few of the questions that have come up in the Q&A into some categories. And I think 2 of the main concerns that are appearing here are with funding and reform. In terms of funding, one of our colleagues brought up the issue. You mentioned global solidarity, but the UN was already facing significant budget cutbacks prior to COVID. And he asks whether or not you think this will sort of reinvigorate global support for the United Nations, or if member states might be more concerned with their own deficits and withdraw funding even further. And in terms of reform, there are a number of questions that are wondering if the UN at 75, which the world looks very different today than it did 75 years ago, if it's still up to the task of its core mandates in this new global world. And so I was wondering if you could just say, like, how is the Secretary General's reform effort going? So those are the two issues. Sorry to give you so much to chew on there.
No, thanks. I mean, funding the UN Secretariat, we have a regular budget which is funded through what is called assessed contributions. So every member state, based on the size of its economy, population, is assessed to pay a due. It's like paying dues. This is not negotiable. If you don't pay them 2 years, then you lose your right to vote. So the problem we have been facing in the last couple of years is, even with the budget that is approved for my department, my division, our department, the Secretariat, there have been delayed payments. So we have a cash flow situation that has really compounded our difficulties from COVID as well. So let's say the UN's budget is, I think it's one point something billion dollars. If payments, the controller would use a small amount of what is called working capital or reserve. A couple of years ago, he reached the point of almost not having enough money to pay the salaries. So what the controller's focus has been in dealing with this cash flow crisis is to ensure that at least the salaries are paid and the contracts that the UN is purchasing, that we pay for the commodities, for the services that we're getting. But everything else is postponed or reduced. So we have seen COVID impact, create additional expenditure related to technology that we need to buy to be able to continue the work. At the same time, reduction in other areas because there is less travel. So we try to do that. So for the assessed budget, definitely it's a cash flow issue. It's not the amounts, because these are agreed, these are dues. Most of the UN system income and budgets are voluntary contributions. So those are coming at the will of the donor countries or organizations or foundations or the private sector. Because if you take WHO, for example, the second largest donor is actually the Gates Foundation to WHO. So that, I think every organization is concerned, because by the end of the year, we know that GDP is shrinking, that governments are looking at their own expenditure and seeing where and how they can commit. But I think we do believe that multilateralism, you have said that people say multilateralism is a crisis, not everywhere and not in the same way. I think a lot of countries and leaders still recognize that, okay, we might have to tighten the belt a little bit, but we still have to ensure that these problems are dealt with through the organizations that people trust, whether it's the World Food Program, the UNICEF, WHO, FAO, UNDP, UNF, others, and the UN Secretariat itself. So we have not seen a dramatic decrease in contributions, and I hope that we will not. But again, we still have a few years before the end of the year. That is a critical issue. The Secretary General, UN leadership continue to appeal that this is not the time to, to reduce funding for humanitarian. If anything, this is the time of solidarity. This is time for us to show the essence of humanity, that we care and we support each other, because one day the person and entity that I supported will come back and help me in a time when I need them. In terms of reform, I think there are issues two sides. There's the reform that the Secretary General can actually implement based on his authority as the Chief Executive Officer of the organization, and he has implemented and initiated several reform initiatives from the moment when one as priority for him was gender equality, for example. we have a new drive to ensure that there's gender equality in the programming as well as representation within the Secretariat. And if for the first time in the organization's history, the top leadership, the Assistant Secretary General, USG level, and the entire Secretariat, those that are appointed by the SG, is 50-50. The resident coordinators, 135 countries, are 50-50, men and women. So there's also an issue that is also often repeated in our programming. We make sure that gender equality is something that we champion and we try to lead by example. There was a peace and security reform that basically streamlined the way that the UN itself works with these issues. It used to be two separate departments: political affairs, peacekeeping affairs, peace building office. It's now merged into the Department of Peace, Political and Peacekeeping Affairs, DPPA, and Department of Operations Support, that actually brought together all of the field operation support, whether it's offices that are part of this department or that department. They are serviced by DOS, what we call DOS. So that was another reform that was, again, negotiated with member states. You get buy-in and endorsed. Going beyond that to the actual essence of what the UN and how it works, the reform of the Security Council, reform of the way budget is, the veto power, that is beyond the Secretary General. That is an issue for member states. And that is an ongoing agenda. I mean, there is a permanent committee for the revitalization of the General Assembly. How can we make the General Assembly more robust, more active, more effective? In previous years, we had the reform which changed the Human Rights Commission to the Human Rights Council, the way that elections are, the universal review, human rights, the universal review of member states, the special procedures, the independent rapporteurs. So if you look at it, the UN today, it doesn't look anything like the UN in 1945. So it's not the same. I mean, peacekeeping, again, there was a time when, of course, the UN was created. If you read the charter from page to page, from cover to end, cover to cover, there is no mention of peacekeeping. It was an innovation. The role of the peace building, again, it's new. It's from 2015. So there is change. There are reforms, but when it comes to things that are beyond the Secretary General, really it's in the hands of member states. And until they agree and they adopt an agenda that takes us forward, we're stuck in this situation.
Maher, I know we're real close to, well, we've almost hit the end of time, and I know you're busy. In a self-interested way, I wanted to ask you one last question. And I mentioned to you before this that we have a number of students who are looking to UN internships with an agreement that the Balsillie School has. And many of our students, whether master's or PhD, are interested in opportunities to work with the UN or in the UN system. We're facing COVID now. With those kind of restrictions and possibly in whatever a post-COVID world will look like, what kind of programs or opportunities are there, whether that be for individual students or for a school like the Balsillie School, to engage with the UN, to work with the UN, to support the UN?
No, thanks, Alistair. And I mean, internships are still, when COVID struck and we had the lockdown, we had a few hundred interns in the UN directly working with the Secretariat or in the funds and programs or in the missions. So they were impacted and affected as any of us. Most of them are 3 to 6 months, so they have probably all have ended their internships. Several of them, if not the majority, actually opted to continue since it was virtual, to go back to their cities, countries, and continue the internships from those countries. And we have started, and then you will find the vacancy. I mean, any office that requires an intern, we go through the same process as a vacancy. We create the profile, we put it on the internship vacancy website. And if people are able to come to New York, they will not be coming to the office because we are still having that restriction. Only 20% of the staff are in the office, socially distanced, wearing masks, etc. We follow very strict guidelines. The moment that we go into phase 3 and people are able to come to the office, then we will invite them if they are able to come to work from the office, because there is a difference between working face-to-face interaction. I mean, in internship, we do not, unfortunately, and I do not like this, but the UN does not pay interns anything. At least the benefit is that you gain experience. You have access to see how things work from the inside. You can find yourself like a fly in the wall in a meeting that you've read about, how things are decided, and informal consultations. You see member states interaction. Virtual, that denies you all of that. Virtual, you will have interactions with your small team. You will get tasks to do. You will do these tasks. You can, of course, attend meetings and follow on webcasts, but anybody can do that. So it is a disadvantage. At the same time, the world of work today is now virtual. Many companies are thinking to continue. Why do we need these expensive offices in Manhattan or in this city or that? If people can work from home, let's work from home. So in a way, it is still an advantage to do that internship. If you identify one that you like, please go ahead, apply for it, and hopefully, before too long, we'll have a vaccine. People will take the vaccine because it's not enough that there's a vaccine. The real solution is not the vaccine, it's vaccination. So we can have a vaccine and only 40% of the people take it. You never reach immunity in the community, and therefore you'll not stop the spread. So we also have to be aware of the need to, and that's part of our campaign, is how do we address vaccine hesitancy? And how is it that the 15-20% hardcore anti-vaxxers, maybe not that high a percentage in all countries, but how come they are actually managed to create a much wider bubble of people who are vaccine hesitant? So it's another question, but hopefully we'll get over that soon.
That's great. Thank you very much, Maher. It does look like we're over time now, and we don't want to keep you. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. That was a fantastic discussion and a very timely one. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us as well. We hope you enjoyed it. And there were some really fantastic questions in the chat that we weren't able to get to, unfortunately. So I apologize for that. And we hope to see you at our next cluster event sometime in November. I'll be in touch with more details about that soon. So thank you again, Maher.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, the students who have stuck with us. And please, do also follow the UN on social media. Do go and become an information volunteer. We try to share as much information as possible. I believe that we, the peoples, the first words of the Charter are what we are supposed to do and be. And transparency is something that guides us. And if we fail sometimes, just let us know and we'll try to do better.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.